schools, whereas my day job is I'm the Deputy Program Manager at L3 Harris for the ADS-B program, the SVS ADS-B program, so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. A little bit of background, I'm also a private pilot, which is why I'm wearing the dorky flight suit here to kind of ham it up. Just to, I always try to show people that I am also a private pilot, because not everybody that works in our shop is an airplane nerd or a pilot, but I am. And this is really, really cool for me, because I've really not had hardly any exposure to the experimental world. I'm coming up on my 30th anniversary of being a pilot, and my wife doesn't know it yet, but the day that'll be my 30th anniversary of my first flight is actually her birthday, so she'll probably be a little bit disappointed when I say, hey, guess what today is? It's my 30th flying anniversary! I'm sure I'm going to hear something about that. But I currently fly a Diamond DA-40, and I've done most of my flying in typical flight school planes for 30 years. So this is really cool for me, because this is a world that I've really had almost no exposure to. So that's really, really neat. So I may be a little bit distracted while I'm trying to do my talk here. But anyway, so at L3 Harris, we run what is usually known as the ADS-B program. But it's technically, according to the FAA, it's called the SVS program, and that's because we run a whole bunch of other pilot systems and services other than just ADS-B. And this presentation is kind of a canned presentation that I'll ad-lib off a lot to make it more pilot-focused and not as much system architecture-focused. So there's some stuff in here that I'll talk more about and some stuff that I'll talk less about. But in general, what really makes the SVS program very different is that as taxpayers, we're actually a services program that we run for the FAA. And the big difference by that is that most of the FAA's other infrastructure, like the radars or the air traffic control centers, all of that, is owned and operated by the FAA. Whereas our system, it's actually owned and operated by us, by a private company. So all of the ADS-B infrastructure around the country, including like the radio site that's in this case right out over on the other side of the runway there, is owned and operated by us, not by the government. And I can say we run it much more efficiently than a government would. And the great thing for you taxpayers is that, and I won't bore you with financials, which you folks don't want to hear about as pilots, but the good thing to know as taxpayers is that it's an incentive-based contract. So the amount of money that we get paid each month actually varies depending on whether or not we hit our requirements each month. And by the requirements, what I'm talking about is the availability of the system in terms of how much downtime or uptime we have, which is a tiny, tiny little amount of downtime we're allowed to have. So there's a tremendous amount of redundancy that's built into our system to ensure that you, the pilots, are always getting served by the SVS system, and that at the same time we're getting paid. Because if we fail to meet our requirements each month, we get paid a disincentive. And if we exceed our requirements, we get an incentive. So it literally changes how much we are paid. And therefore, it really does incentivize us to make sure that our system is extremely available and that we do hit our requirements. But anyway, a little bit of history about it. So basically, we, or our corporate predecessors, we won the contract back in 2007. And it's gone through a bunch of names because, as I'm sure you're familiar, mergers and acquisitions, that's always a constant thing. When I joined the company, we were ITT, and then ITT became Excelis, and then a couple years ago we merged with Harris, and then Harris merged with L3, so now we have this somewhat awkward corporate name of L3 Harris. But it's actually been the same group of people in the past 16, 17 years who have developed and built this whole system. We're in Herndon, Virginia here, not too far away from here, which is where we have all of our engineering personnel and where we run the system from. And we've done tours there a couple of times. I'm also a member of Smokehouse Pilots, which is a group centered at Leesburg Airport. And I've done a couple tours for Smokehouse people through our facility. So if you folks ever have any interest, we can bring small tours through, and you'll see some of the stuff that I'll show in the presentation here. But anyway, the core system that most people typically know us for is ADS-B, because that's the one that most pilots interact with. And a lot of pilots just think about ADS-B as the air-to-air system, whereas the reason why we have a contract with the FAA all of the ground infrastructure is that we're the ones that basically take the ADS-B signals that your planes are emanating, we receive it, we filter it, we validate it to make sure that it is legitimate before it actually goes on the glass on a controller's scope. So there's a lot of software validation that's involved. I see there's a lot of stuff in the media. When ADS-B first became mandatory for the mandate, there was a lot of stuff out there about how the link isn't encrypted. Therefore, anybody could spoof the system. And the reality is that's very uninformed, because you might be able to broadcast over the airwaves a latitude, longitude that says you're hovering over Dulles Airport. But the reality is we do a lot of validation to make sure that what goes onto the glass on a controller screen really is legitimate, to make sure that spoofing, either intentional or unintentional, doesn't end up there. But anyway, so ADS-B is really the core technology that really enabled our system and really motivated the FAA to set up this system. Most of you are aware that the real difference. I usually tell people who aren't pilots that it usually really surprises people to know that most air traffic control today, when you're flying in an airliner, or even us GA folks, what the controller's seeing on their screen doesn't come from radar. It comes from our system now. Our system is the primary ATC sensor, and radar now, whether it's a secondary radar or a primary radar, that's the secondary or the tertiary system. So what the controllers are using in the vast majority of the cases is our data. And the huge advantage of ADS-B compared to radar is that it's much lower cost, it's much more precise, it's much more reliable. I usually tell people that aren't pilots, if you can just imagine just the physics of it, of a radar that's on the ground, it has a beam that's emanating out in space. So inherently, the farther you get away from that radar, the wider that beam is. And certainly, radars today are more precise than they were in the 1940s, but still, essentially, you can't really get away from that physics. Whereas with ADS-B, if the plane has a GPS, the precision of that GPS location isn't a function of how far away you are from a radar. It's as precise as it's ever going to be. So that's really just one of the core beauties of ADS-B, is that it ends up being much, much more precise information. In addition to the fact that the ADS-B data includes all sorts of things like your velocity vector, flight plan information, all sorts of additional goodies other than just your latitude, longitude, and altitude. So anyway, this is a pictograph that sort of shows some of the elements of our system, which we'll get into some of it later on. Our system basically uses, there's two bands for ADS-B. UAT, which is the 978 frequency shown by the little GA plane there, and then 1090 shown by the airliner there. And that was something that is fairly unique, that ADS-B is in use over a lot of the world, but the US, the FAA implementation of it is fairly unique in using these two different frequency bands. And part of that was that 15, 16, 20 years ago, the thinking was that the 978 frequency would be much more economical for GA transponders. The UAT system also uses bandwidth for GA for things like FIS-B, which we can get into later on, that provide products specifically for the GA audience that the airlines don't necessarily need. I was saying that our system is mostly known as ADS-B, but the Surveillance and Broadcast Services System, it's this omnibus program, and we basically provide a bunch of different services in addition to ADS-B. So they're basically broken down into services that are oriented towards air traffic control as the end user, and services that are oriented towards you pilots as the end user. Although all of them, they do serve multiple audiences, but just in general, ADS-B is, as we were saying, it's the linking of your own ownership traffic information. And then I've got a couple more slides that go into more detail about some of the other services here. And certainly, any of you feel free to interrupt me at any time here. So ADS-B itself, like I was saying, it uses two different frequencies. Those are both internationally managed standards. So there's a couple standards bodies that jointly manage the specification for the different frequencies and the actual data that's sent out over them. Both of those frequencies have different link versions which have evolved also. So that chart in the center basically shows that link version 0 is basically the experimental version. It was really the first version of FIS-B. And then link versions 1 or 2 came about after that, with link version 2 being the current version that the mandate that the FAA has when you're near controlled airspace. That's what your avionics have to be broadcasting. And then the one that says 3, coming soon, that is the next generation of the FIS-B standard, which we're currently working on. And your transponders don't yet have to broadcast that. Even when that is done, the existing current installations will be grandfathered. So that is something that the FAA isn't going to tell you you have to go out and replace all of your current transponders. But the Link version 3 transponders will have a lot of advantages that certainly, once that standard is done, if you do want to buy a Link version 3 transponder, you certainly will get additional benefits out of it. One of the biggest ones is there's a facility called ADS Weather that basically your plane will allow your plane to share the plane's currently perceived weather air to air with other airplanes and also air to ground. So it'll basically like being an electronic PIREP, if you will. So your airplane will be able to continually report a PIREP to the other planes around you and to folks on the ground. So it'll potentially give access to everybody to a huge pool of weather data of what's currently happening in real time up there.
How soon will Link version 3 be available?
That's a good question. The standards themselves have been agreed upon. There's an organization that we're a member of called RTCA that's described along the bottom there. That's a joint body that we participate in along with the FAA, with NASA, with airlines, with Eurocontrol, the European authorities. So the standards are jointly, as a collaborative way, worked on. So the standards have been agreed to. The avionics are not yet available, and the FAA just gave us a contract to be able to ingest the data that the transponders, Link version 3 transponders, will be sending. We just got that a couple of months ago, and that'll be about a 2-year effort for us to work on it. So a lot of those advantages, they're about 2 to 3 to 4 years out. So it's nothing that's around the corner. But eventually it will be a huge improvement, because especially that concept of being able to get continual PIREPs from all the other planes around you, could really be a game changer, and especially in terms of things like turbulence. Because turbulence is something that the airlines have really been pushing for better prediction of that, because from what I've been told, that the biggest source of workman's comp claims for the airlines is flight attendants who are up walking around all the time. They're not belted, and then the plane hits turbulence, and what happens is their head gets jammed up against the ceiling. So the airlines have a tremendous motivation to try to get better data on turbulence. And if everybody's plane up there is reporting on their current conditions, that really gives you a great ability to know where the turbulence is, and for meteorologists to have more data to refine their models to be able to predict where turbulence can be. So that's something that it won't necessarily have a beneficial impact right away, but it'll start to open up the potential for much better modeling of turbulence and things like that.
I was thinking it would be great for glider pilots too.
And for glider, anybody who really is very concerned about that mass of air up there, right? Oh yeah. So I was talking about the availability requirements, and like I said, I won't really belabor that, but just to give you an idea, the ADS-B service itself, our contract basically requires what's called 5 nines of availability. So that means it has to be available 99.999% of the time, which means if you do the math, that means we can have a downtime of 25 seconds in a month. And that's for the ADS-B service. And then for the other services that I'll talk about, some of them go down to only 3 nines of availability, which translates to 43 minutes of downtime in a month. So every month, we have to have a very involved process with the FAA where we go down through every single one of our 740 so radio sites, and we give them the statistics for which ones were online, degraded, or offline, and we do the math to determine what was the composite downtime. And that affects our maintenance philosophy, and that affects our invoice that we're paid each month. It has a very big impact on how we run the program. But it's an extremely stringent availability requirement. So then the rest of the services that you don't commonly hear about, in addition to ADS-B, the first one, which is a pilot-oriented service, is called ADSR, for ADS-B rebroadcast. And what that basically means is that since there are these 2 different frequencies, ADSR is a system that allows you, a GA person with a UAT transponder, to hear the 1090 data that an airliner is broadcasting. That information basically goes down to one of our radio sites, and we determine what needs to get rebroadcasted on the opposite frequency. So we're continually echoing all of that information on a case-by-case basis, such that both flavors of transponder can have awareness and can hear each other. And there's this illustration of a hockey puck, we call it, because that system, it requires a lot of bandwidth to be doing that echoing of the data. So we basically only rebroadcast that when we know that there are 2 aircraft within that horizontal and vertical hockey puck, so to speak, which have an opposite frequency transponder. So it's not continually rebroadcasting things, it's only rebroadcasting it when we realize that there's 2 aircraft up there who are in proximity to each other who need to be told of the opposite flavor of transponder. And then the next service, which is also a pilot-oriented service, is FIS-B, Traffic Information Services. And this is intended in areas in which ADS-B isn't mandated, outside from Class B and Class C airports. We get basically the data of aircraft that are seen by radar that aren't necessarily equipped with an ADS-B transponder, and we send their radar-derived information up via ADS-B to ADS-B equipped aircraft so that you can see where the non-ADS-B equipped aircraft are. And that also operates just on a case-by-case basis. If there is another aircraft that's 17 miles laterally and 7,000 feet vertically from you, just to cut down on the amount of RF bandwidth that we have to use. And then the next pilot-oriented service is FIS-B, which, for years you could potentially pay to use XM satellite weather to get NEXRAD and METARs and TAFs and that kind of thing into your aircraft. Whereas FIS-B provides a similar set of weather products and TFRs and NOTAMs and all that kind of good stuff, except it's free. It's paid for by the taxpayer. It's not paid as an XM satellite subscription. So this is a system which is a ground-to-air uplink, and unlike those other systems I was just talking previously, this is just a continual broadcast. It's not a function of whether there's anybody up there. So the Frederick tower that's over there is broadcasting FIS-B all the time. I tell people it's just like an FM radio station. It's broadcasting whether or not there's anybody up there listening or not. We have a long list of products that FIS-B uplinks. The most important probably is the NEXRAD weather radar, which provides you that graphical image of weather. But we send METARs, TAF forecasts, NOTAMs, TFRs, SIGMETs. There's graphical lightning, turbulence, icing, cloud tops, the wind aloft product, all that stuff. And of course, TFRs, obviously very important in this part of the country, being near the SFRA and the FRZ and being near the Camp David restricted area and all of that. So that certainly is very important. The TFRs are set up both graphically and textually, so you can see that polygon of where the TFR is. And the FAA has also had 2 batches of additional FIS-B products that they paid us to add. Some of the ones that are in the middle there, lightning, turbulence, and icing, those were an addition that we put through just a couple years ago. And then we've also been, we paid to improve the icing data that goes up there, because that's a very important safety thing as well. We've also had recently worked on, there's a lot of TFRs that only affect unmanned aircraft, and those were lumped into the same pot, so to speak. And the FAA and pilot community, I know AOPA had lobbied to get that into a better manageable situation. So now the TFRs that we send up are segregated by TFRs that are only intended to be relevant to unmanned aircraft and TFRs that are only intended to be related to manned aircraft. So that way you know what you're getting. So FIS-B is it's a very important component of our systems. And then some of the systems that are oriented more towards air traffic control, and this one probably gets into the most geekly subject matter, so I won't go too much into the math for this one, but a component of our system that's called WAM, for Wide Area Multilateration. I was saying that the ADS-B system itself relies on your plane having an ADS-B transponder that's hooked up to your GPS, and that basically sends your GPS-derived information out to other aircraft or down to air traffic control. Whereas WAM is a system that is very different. The FAA has paid for us to implement WAM only at a subset of places across the country. So they've paid for us to do WAM in some very high traffic area airports like Charlotte, LAX, but also in some places that have very challenging terrain, so radar really doesn't have much of a view. Juneau, Alaska, if any of you have ever flown into Juneau or have seen pictures, Juneau it's in a very, very challenging terrain with mountains all around, not much radar line of sight. So WAM is a system that basically does triangulation, for lack of a better term. And it basically relies on, where we've been paid to implement WAM, we have to have a much denser constellation of our ground-based radio stations, because instead of just listening for the ADS-B information that it tells us, we're basically using multiple radio sites to interrogate an aircraft, and by triangulation, we're figuring out what its position is. So it's something that doesn't rely on having an ADS-B transponder, but it's very, very precise. In the case of Charlotte, they paid for us to implement WAM because Charlotte has, I think, 3 parallel runways. I might have gotten that wrong, but I think they have 3. But they only have 1 radar, and they don't have any radar redundancy. So if they lose that radar, they can't do triple parallel approaches, whereas the WAM system does allow them to do triple parallel approaches, so it really increases their arrival capacity. And the FAA has also paid us to implement WAM in a couple relatively smaller Colorado airports, where the FAA actually paid for it jointly together with the individual Colorado towns, because they're ski towns. Telluride, Gunnison, Aspen, there's about 5 or 6 of them, where basically they don't have radar there. They weren't going to get radar, and radar isn't really suitable because it's very mountainous there, but their whole economy depends on skiers coming in. And when do skiers usually want to come in? In bad weather, bad flying weather, right? So that was a real contradiction. And of course that's how their bread is buttered. So the towns there basically have a cost share arrangement with the FAA where they paid for us to implement WAM there, so they can do IFR approaches to their airport, and the skiers can come in, even when the weather is relatively bad. So it really was a very direct benefit for them, and it's at the same time it's much more reliable than a radar with the traditional rotating mechanism. Another one of the ATC-oriented systems that we operate is called space-based ADS-B. And the big difference there is that here in the US, our system, we have a set of about 740 of these radio sites, which I'll get into radio sites a little bit later. And that provides our reception to hear ADS-B data for people over the US airspace. In other parts of the world, particularly in oceanic areas, ADS-B is picked up by a satellite system. The Iridium Next constellation was originally put in orbit for sat phone, satellite phone service, but it actually has a payload tucked onto the bottom of it that literally was kind of an afterthought. That after the satellites were being designed, they realized they had extra electrical power and extra space, and L3Harris produced a ADS-B receiver that basically sits on the bottom of the Iridium satellites, and we basically hear ADS-B information. There's a company in Tyson's Corner called Arion that is our partner. We basically write and operate the software, and Arion operates the system to do space-based ADS-B, and it's intended to provide ADS-B reception over either oceanic areas, where obviously there is no radar anyway, or other parts of the world where there isn't radar to begin with. And that's a system that has come about, it was sort of a second generation to our terrestrial system. It's something that will probably never replace our ground-based constellation of radios that we use for ADS-B service here in the US, because here in the US we have a much denser radio noise environment than you would over oceanic areas or even over most other parts of the world. You know, we have more garage door openers, TV stations, you name it. So the ability of the satellite to hear the relatively weak ADS-B signal up in space is really a function of the signal-to-noise ratio. And that works fine in most other parts of the world, except for over here in the US, where we have so much radio noise. So that's why we still rely on the set of 700 some ADS-B ground-based sites, and we don't necessarily rely on the satellite system, just because of the inherent difference in the signal-to-noise ratio. And we've got a second page here about the SVA system. I won't get into too much detail around it. A lot of other air traffic control authorities around the world use space-based ADS-B as their primary system. And some of them are even equity partners and own a share of Arion. But we operate the system together with Arion, and like I said, we write and maintain the software that drives their system to drive that capability.
Good question. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you hear about GPS outages here and there.
Yeah.
How does that affect ADS-B, right? Because you're depending on a plane sending its GPS coordinates.
Right. The Air Force has, there have been episodes where there's been, the DoD themselves does exercises where they're doing jamming, and the FAA will put out a notice saying GPS may be unreliable in a certain radius or a certain area. That's usually very conservative. They're being very conservative in terms of what kind of area is affected by that. But it is true that essentially ADS-B does rely on GPS to get the location information. So some components of our system, like WAM, don't use ADS-B transponders, but WAM is only implemented in certain parts of our system. So it is inherent that the majority of the system does depend on GPS. And so much of our national infrastructure is dependent on GPS. A lot of people don't even realize how much GPS timing is used for stock market transactions, for electrical power transmission. The electrical power grid uses GPS timing. So the GPS satellites, not only are they providing location information, but there's a lot of our national infrastructure that uses just their very precise timing information. And that is something that the government does have a couple initiatives that haven't rolled out completely to provide, they call it ANPT, alternate navigation position and timing, for a system that's not GPS, that would still provide something like that. And we have some people who are working on one of those efforts, but nothing has been totally implemented yet. But that is really important, particularly if there were ever a shooting war. because so much of our infrastructure does depend on satellites these days. So that is really a very important thing for the government to move further along. So more about the infrastructure elements. We'd like to say that our system is the world's largest ATC sensor system because we have 740 plus of the radio sites. When our contract was given, one thing that's very, even a lot of pilots don't realize is that when you look at the layout, it's kind of hard to see here, but there's actually little yellow dots there where there's a radio site. And this just shows it within the 48 states, whereas we have SBS radio sites in Guam, Saipan, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, plenty of places that are US territory other than the 48 states, which is just the graphic I have there. But our contract was basically given that we needed to basically mimic or exceed the coverage of the current FAA radar system, because all of the IFR approach routes and all of that are all predicated on where radar can currently see. And radar can't see everywhere in the US, particularly out west where there's terrain. So our system, we were basically required to have coverage that was at least as good as radar. But once again, we're not omniscient. We don't have radio sites everywhere, particularly out west where there's terrain. So that's why if you can get close enough to this map to see it, you can see that the yellow dots are much more farther spread out west. And that really is the reason why, is that our system is intended to provide the same coverage that radar can, and radars are much more dense here on the East Coast. And that's where the majority of the US population still is much more dense on the East Coast compared to the West.
Did you completely skip Montana?
No, Montana is there. It is
No,
there.
there's like 4 spots in Montana.
That may be something that went wacky with the Google Map depiction. Yeah, I never noticed that. You're right. There aren't, but there's more than that. I can promise you. Yeah, there's more than that. Another really unusual thing about our system is that you'll see there's dots in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico here. And that is because we have ADS-B sites on Gulf of Mexico oil platforms, which provide them with the ability to do over-the-horizon IFR flight, which they never could do before. Prior to our system, they were basically doing position reports the old-fashioned way. And once they left the horizon of radar, they were basically on their own, just like in the olden days. Whereas now, we have ADS-B sites on, I think, 17 of the oil platforms out there, such that they can get radar-like surveillance, and they still have somebody looking over their shoulder and seeing where they are. When I first started working on the ADS-B program, I had no idea that there are literally hundreds of helicopters that go in and out from the Gulf every day, ferrying spare parts and personnel back and forth. It's a huge operation that they have there. So that's been a huge safety improvement, and the oil and gas industry, they were some of the most stringent early supporters of ADS-B for that reason. And they also have AWAS stations on those oil platforms as well. So that really gave them a tremendous ability to know what the weather was going to be like on that platform before they head out from Louisiana or Texas for those flights. So this is just an overview of the infrastructure. So we've got the radio stations, we've got what are called service delivery points. Those are basically the racks that sit at FAA facilities like control towers or TRACONs or centers. That's what basically puts our data on their glass, lets them see the blips. And then the regional control stations, we'll get into that a little bit, another slide or two here later. So our system, the way the FAA has it divided up for air traffic control purposes is a concept called service volumes. And it basically means that an en route service volume, those are the same borders as ARTCs. So we provide an en route service volume for each center's airspace. And then we also have terminal service volumes that correspond to terminal areas. And then surface service volumes, we actually have, there's a smaller number of the busiest Class B airports that have multiple ADS-B radio sites on the airport surface, Dulles being the closest one here. And that way we can provide coverage on the ground of taxiing aircraft to have the controllers have positional information of where the taxiing aircraft are. And then there are also other things called composite traffic volumes, which, as the FAA has done some consolidations of like Potomac TRACON here is an example, where Potomac TRACON is in one place, but they're actually controlling the traffic from what is it, National, Dulles, BWI, Richmond, all from one facility. So in this case, we send the data for all of those facilities to one physical place. So the regional control stations, what this means is that our facility is in Herndon, Virginia. We have a relatively normal office building. We do have a generator, but our facility is not where the actual data processing for our system is done, because it all needs to be hardened and secure and redundant. So there are basically 12 regional control stations across the country, and they are basically data centers. I mean, if I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar being in this area with what a data center looks like. So they are hardened and secure facilities, and that's where our data processing is actually done. So none of the live operational data for ATC actually flows through my building. It all flows through these facilities. They're all designed to be redundant. We have a spare RCS called the disaster recovery, which can also take over for any of the other ones. So once again, the whole intent of this is to have extremely high availability. So no matter Murphy's Law, what happens, we can still provide the ATC service. And that's a beautiful picture of what the outside of one of the RCSs looks like. Like I said, it's just a data center. And on the inside, it's basically racks, rack-mounted of our servers. Typically, every element of our infrastructure is redundant. So we typically have, you can see the picture on the right there, we basically have identical A-side and B-side racks, because almost every piece of equipment in our system is redundant to be able to meet the availability requirements. And then the radio station infrastructure. So that's a picture that I just grabbed today from Google Street View of the radio site that's right here, right across the runway. In the case of the radio sites, the vast majority of our 700-some radio sites are actually on cell phone towers, whereas this is an example of what we would call a greenfield site. When we did our initial coverage analysis to figure out where we were going to have to put the 700 and some radio sites, in most cases we were able to basically lease space for our antennas on existing cell phone towers. However, in cases where there wasn't a cell phone tower available, but we needed to have coverage in a certain area, we've given the aviation community and the FAA a real bonus in that we've typically situated them at general aviation airports, like here at Frederick. Because we could have easily positioned the radio to cover this general area a mile or two away, but by virtue of the fact that we were able to situate it on an airport property, means that you end up having coverage on the ramp here, which we're not required to do, but it ends up being a great fringe benefit. So the greenfield sites that we call them typically look like this, as opposed to being a cell phone tower. And typically, it's a fenced-in enclosure, and it typically has a radio cabinet with, once again, a redundant pair of radios, and then a generator. Every one of our sites has to have backup power. So they're either a diesel or a propane generator. In some rare cases, there are some solar arrays. And an important part of our ability to be hardened for natural disasters like hurricanes is whenever there's a hurricane, tornado, something like that that's coming through an area, part of our procedures are we have to have the generators topped off at the radio sites that could be affected. That way we can ensure that they have the ability to ride out a loss of commercial power. So we go around and have those topped off. But that's what the radio sites look like. The site itself, typically, I was saying that we have the two different frequencies. So there's typically one UAT 978 antenna, and then there's either 4 1090 antennas that each cover a 90-degree sector, or in some cases there's just one omnidirectional antenna that covers the 1090 band. And then they also have a GPS antenna But that's typically what they look like.
All your cell towers have those generators and everything?
They also do, yeah. They typically have a cabinet with a generator like that. Like I said, we have some that have solar, but not many. The vast majority of them are either diesel or propane. So once again, I was saying, we like to boast that it's the world's largest air traffic control surveillance network, and this is the thing that really does show not just the 48 states, but our constellation, I think, stretches, what did it say, 8,000 some miles from the Virgin Islands all the way to Guam and Saipan. In Alaska, you'll notice a lot of the dots are very far apart. Alaska was the only part of U.S. territory where we weren't required to have coverage that exceeded current radar coverage, but just in the past 6 months or so, the FAA finally gave us a contract to basically fill that gap. So we currently provided coverage on the relatively more populated parts of Alaska, the Panhandle and basically the coast. But now we're basically finally filling in the inland part with radio sites there. And that, to build things in Alaska is as challenging as you could imagine it would be, because typically our sites need to be at the top of a mountain to have good coverage. And the top of a mountain in Alaska is a pretty rugged place to build anything. So the build season is usually about 2 months in Alaska. The joke for our construction people is there's mud season, there's ice season, and there's build season. And build season is like June and July, and that's it. We have to use helicopters, we have to use snowcats, snowmobiles, dog sled teams. We had one of our technicians had they were going to the top of the mountain about 5 years ago. I was in the office, and the helicopter exceeded its hover out of ground effect ceiling before it got up to the top, and they basically had a slow motion mush into the side of the mountain. And our two engineers actually got out of the helicopter with the radio equipment and the pilot, brushed themselves off, and continued walking about another 500 feet up to the top of the mountain, repaired the radio equipment, and did all of that before the sheriff department rescue helicopter got up there and then took them back down to a hospital to have them checked out, which was amazing.
I guess they figured they're going to wait around anyway.
Exactly, because they were told that it's going to be about 45 minutes for the sheriff department helicopter to get there, so that was just incredible. But the effort that we've had to go to build stuff in Alaska is Herculean. And when I first came on the program, since I'm a pilot, one of my responsibilities was the flight test planning for our flight test plane, which you'll see in a couple more slides here. And that was my first exposure to laying out an old-fashioned paper sectional chart of Alaska. I had to buy all the Alaska sectionals. That was before SkyVector or ForeFlight or anything like that. And I was just amazed, because I'd be planning out the routes, and there'd be places on the Alaskan sectional where there'd be a black dot and it said cabin, singular. And basically that meant that the only thing of note anywhere around is a cabin. And the whole point was, if you go down, that's the place you would walk to, because at least there's a cabin there, and that's it.
Well, is it possible any of those things could actually find Bigfoot?
And get a blurry picture of Bigfoot? Yeah.
How do they get power to those sites?
Yeah.
Well, power and telecommunications is a huge problem. And sometimes we have to pay to run new power or telecom lines. In rare cases, the FAA has allowed us to use microwave or satellite communications, but often that has a much longer latency in terms of the delay that it takes for data to get there. So that's something that we can only kind of use as a last resort. But that often is a problem, and that often dictates where we can go, because some of these, like I said, the places that have the best radio line of sight, being at the top of a mountain, you typically don't find electricity running up to the top of the mountain or communications lines. So there's another slide that just talks about the equipment redundancy. Like I was saying, we typically have an A side and B side for just about everything. Even here, at the Frederick Radio, we basically have a completely redundant set of radio equipment, and it's a warm standby situation where both of those radios are receiving data all the time. They're both operating, but only one of them is sending information out. So that way, if one side encounters any kind of a fault, it can be very quickly switched over. And we have one display in my building that basically shows a map of all 740 radio sites, and it shows which ones are fully operational on both sides, or which ones have a fault on one side or the other. And there's a very complicated set of switchover logic that can switch them proactively from one side to the other, or reactively if something goes wrong. And the whole point is to be able to maintain that 5 nines of availability such that it is always on the air and sending and receiving data. And then the other part of redundancy is the actual radio coverage redundancy itself. This is what allows us to actually lose some of the radio sites, but still be able to meet our coverage requirements and our availability requirements, because we don't need to have all 740 of those radio sites in order to be able to have the geographic coverage. We basically overbuilt the system to allow us to have redundancy. And there's a cool tool on the FAA SBS program website where it has an interactive slider bar for altitude. And you can basically set the slider bar for 1,000 feet AGL or 5,000 or 10,000, and it will basically draw the coverage for you. And it will basically show you, where there's a coverage gap as you go down in altitude. Here where we don't have that much terrain, it's not much of a factor. If you go out west, it's a much bigger factor as you get lower down and the coverage gaps broaden. But like I said, we do have tremendous radio overlap to allow us to maintain the requirements. And then service delivery points, I think I briefly said, that these are basically the racks that are situated at the FAA facilities where the data actually goes onto the controller's screens. So we typically have 223 of those basically at towers, at TRACONs, at centers, and that's where the data actually shows up for ATC. And then I was talking about how we have a screen that shows the status of things. So at my building in Herndon, we do have what's called the Network Operations Center. And that's basically a secured room in our building that's staffed 24/7, 365. It's got those 3 rows of screens with big screens along the front. And there are people there basically, shifts all the time to monitor our system. And when any of the radio sites or any of the service delivery points get a fault or go offline, these are the people that see the alarm. These are the people that put in orders for the diesel fuel to be topped off before there's a storm. When there's a snowstorm coming, these people know to bring a sleeping bag with them, because if they can't get home, they will be staying there. We've had people that have been in our knock for like 3 or 4 days at a time when there's been bad weather. And then this is also redundant. We have a backup knock in Dulles, at Dulles Airport, at a building in the office park there at Dulles. And then we also have another backup to the backup in Moorestown, New Jersey. And the philosophy behind that, it was a very carefully architected configuration that our backup facility is our local backup in Dulles, Virginia. And the intent for that is that if my building burned down, the people would still be able to drive to Dulles, Virginia. The same people would be able to staff it. However, if there were a larger situation that affected both buildings, something we don't like to really talk about, then there would be a different set of people who would still run our system from a geographically separated place up in New Jersey. So that the whole intent of it is to be able to handle multiple levels of potential disruption. And then this is a slide that you folks can relate more to. One of the biggest changes in our program was that 16, 17 years ago when ADS-B first came out, no one really, particularly in the FAA, foresaw the advent of portable avionics. That was something that just didn't occur to people. So back then, particularly Garmin was one of the first to do panel-mounted FIS-B and ADS-B displays. And it was only after we were running the system for a couple of years that the whole advent of portable avionics, things like Stratuses, started to become apparent. So that's something that has really, lowered the price point by which people can have a display of ADS-B and FIS-B and FIS-B in the cockpit. That's been a great development. The fact that you can pay just like I don't know what Stratus sells for like $400 these days, and you can display it on a phone or a tablet. Of course, none of that is FAA certified because the FAA considers that to be not part of your plane, but it's just a consumer product. So that's a big reason why their price point is so low, because they're not part of the airplane, they're not FAA certified, they certainly don't have the same level of rigor to them, but at the same time, as a consumer product, I mean, any of you who use like Garmin Pilot or ForeFlight knows that the update cycle of that is so much more rapid than what a certified piece of avionics has, so that's a huge advantage. And then I was saying we have a flight test plane, so that's me at the bottom left there. We have a Caravan that is our flight test bird, and for years it was on a never-ending mission where it was basically verifying ADS-B coverage everywhere across the country as we were building out the system, all 740 of those radio sites. So I got to be the guy in back for some of the missions. I wasn't qualified to be the guy up front, unfortunately. That would have been more fun for me. But so I did get to go along as the flight test engineer. And the Caravan's been a fantastic bird for us because, if any of you are familiar with the Caravan, it's basically like a 172 with a turbine engine. It's very reliable, it's very simple, it's fixed landing gear, it's not pressurized. So when you read the POH for it, it's almost like a 172 in terms of its systems. It just happens to have a turbine engine up front. So it's very reliable, and it's a great bird for us because, as you can see the picture at the bottom right there, I think a Caravan can normally seat 9 people, but in this case we only have 2 seats, and it gives us lots of room for equipment racks. So we have a portable avionics pallet, which was what I was operating, which basically receives everything on both ADS-B frequencies that's being uplinked and downlinked and records everything. So I would basically plot out flight test missions that look at each service volume as we were building it out, and verifying that our system has coverage at different altitudes and along all of the approach routes and fixes, and making sure that we're going to hit our requirements. And the Caravan's been great because it's incredibly reliable. I think for a couple of years we never missed a single test flight for any kind of maintenance downing on the airplane. We went for a couple of years like that, which was amazing. So that's been a great asset for us. Unfortunately, it's not based here because the costs of having a hangar in a high cost of living area. So it's actually based up in upstate New York. But it comes through here for us to reinstall flight test avionics. So we typically have it land at Leesburg, the closest airport to our facility, and we meet it there before it goes off on some of its flight test missions. So that's been a great asset for us. And then the last slide here is just what we're currently been adding. We got our contract 16, 17 years ago, and we're actually coming up toward the end of our contract. We're running it until 2025, although the FAA has just given us a notice of intent to award a successor contract, so we'll be able to operate the system going into the future. But the whole 17 years we've had the contract, the FAA has added more and more scope and features to it. So we've added a bunch of wide area multilateration sites, some of the additional Colorado sites that I was talking about. I had mentioned that we're adding radio sites to the remainder of Alaska, filling in all of that. We've continued to add more Gulf of Mexico oil platforms. The oil platforms that are out there in the Gulf change month after month. As the price of crude oil goes up and down, the number of oil platforms that's in operation actually changes. So they'll take some out of operation if oil gets cheaper, and as it becomes economical to drill in deeper places, they'll actually move some of the sites. So we're continually shuffling our ADS-B installations on the Gulf of Mexico oil platforms around. We've also been adding ADS-B service delivery points to a lot of Navy and Air Force ATC facilities. Initially it was just civilian air traffic control that got ADS-B for their ATC. So the military has been in a little bit later phase with that. So we've been working on installing ADS-B at ATC facilities at about 18 naval air stations and Air Force bases currently. And we'll be doing that for about the next 2 years. And then we also, every 6 months, we add new METAR and TAF reporting stations to the FIS-B system. As additional airports, get an AWAS installation, we add those to the network. We've also been adding a lot of ADS-B validation improvements. I was touching on that a little bit as far as making our system hardened to prevent spoofing, either intentional or unintentional. I was talking about how we've had some of the icing forecast improvements as well. I had mentioned about how we have unmanned aircraft TFRs that are segregated from the manned ones. And then that last bullet there was what I was talking about with the ADS-B version 3 transponder enhancements with the ADS-B weather downlink and crosslink, that'll be a huge potential improvement, and we're working on the software for that right now. It's the people in our own building that work on the software that write all of the software for all of these, so it's a huge effort. So I think that's the last slide. So any other questions? Yeah.
So some of the ADS-B out systems give you the option when it's installed, install a switch. You can select anonymous.
Right.
And how anonymous is that?
That's another thing kind of similar to the portable avionics that nobody really considered when ADS-B first came out, and then there were all these concerns about, I need to be anonymous. So there's a couple different levels of that. There's sensitive flights, and then there's anonymity. So anybody can request to get anonymity. There's been a lot of stuff in the media about people who track Elon Musk's flight, or corporations who want to track each other. But I think anybody can request anonymity. Whereas there's also sensitive aircraft filtering, which is a little bit different. So we do, for obvious reasons, we filter Air Force One, we filter Marine One, for obvious reasons. And there's a lot of other aircraft that can request or are given just by default sensitive aircraft filtering. All of the along the southern border, all of the Customs Service and DEA flights, those are all considered sensitive aircraft, so those are all filtered.
Like your caravan?
So they're,
Just looked it up.
yeah.
Restricted from public view.
Oh, okay.
But what I'm saying is our ADS-B transmitters,
Right.
we actually, mine has a toggle switch.
Right.
I can flip it to anonymous. An air traffic controller won't see my tail number
Right.
anymore.
He'll still see your target. Right. Right.
So behind the scenes, if you were asked to identify that target, which airplane it was, that's what I mean by how anonymous is that.
Right.
What are you planning on doing?
Right. I think technically the answer is we do have the data. Now, whether or not we've ever gotten a subpoena or something like that, I don't know. But we do have the data.
Or you can't say.
You have the data for the target. You don't have the tail number for the target.
They have it.
I'm not really sure that's true.
Yeah, they have it.
I'm not really sure that's true.
But is it more for the public, for other people to track it outside from the FAA, right?
Right.
You
right.
hide from the regular, people, not.
Right. I mean, like I said, there have been a lot of examples in the media of
Okay.
people who are tracking Elon Musk's flight,
Right.
or even when there's a merger and acquisition.
Okay.
If company A can see that company B's plane is going to their competitor's office, then they know that those two are doing a deal. That there's competitive reasons for doing that, and then there's people that just have personal safety concerns. So there's all sorts of reasons for that. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, if not, thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you.